Came across a video by Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk TV. Not a big fan of Talk TV, particularly since they employed the vulgar Jeremy Kyle. And I've always known that Julia Hartley-Brewer is conservative in her worldview, so I'm not surprised really. But the big clickbait catch was Julia Hartley-Brewer hits out at unemployed people claiming benefits and big block capitals tough exclamation mark. Now, one thing I was pleasantly surprised by is I kind of expected it's a Talk TV video. There'll be a lot of right wing comments endorsing that. Interestingly enough, it was the opposite. There were a lot of people pointing out exactly why she was wrong and not endorsing that. So, despite the Tories' narrative, it may well be that there isn't actually public support for their welfare threats. I do think, unfortunately, there will always be ill-informed people out there who will endorse that sort of narrative. Um, and you can extend this to other areas whereby people will have strong views on things and they haven't thought it through. None of us can know everything all at once, and I'm not going to claim that I um, know everything about every given subject. But perhaps it's a lesson that we should all reflect on every angle of a given subject. I could do that more, and I think we all should. But I want to just talk a little bit about individuals like Julia Hartley-Brewer because she's not alone, unfortunately. You know, when I said that Sunak's making these welfare threats, I think it's from the basis that two reasons. I think it's coming up to a general election, and I think he's trying to pitch to the base. Now, some might say, well, he's doing it because he has to, because the numbers have increased. Well, as I pointed out, of course the numbers are going to change from the pandemic levels. The pandemic was an exceptional situation. So, of course, the number of people, because there was people working from home, there was all sorts of different situations going on then. So, of course, the statistics are going to change from the pandemic levels of 2020, 2021. Their argument is that there's a big increase in the number of people claiming sickness benefits. Now, I'll just reiterate briefly what I said in the last video, which is that yes, some people might abuse the system, and yes, it's all money, it has to be paid for, it is a big increase. But here's the problem I have with someone like Julia Hartley-Brewer. She is not lashing out at those who fraud the system. She's just making a sweeping attack on everyone who signs on. Um, and it reiterates what I think about the worldview that conservatives have on this. I think they've got survival of the fittest mindset. And I think it goes something like this. I've worked hard, I'm successful, they've got no excuse. I think that's basically their attitude. I think most Tory MPs think like this. So if someone's unemployed, they must be lazy. If someone is homeless, they must be an addict or they must have done something wrong in their private life. I think there is a callous nature to conservative thinking, and they always talk about it as being a sort of patrician looking after people, one nation Toryism. But I see little evidence of that because how can you say you're being compassionate and you're trying to help people when you're simultaneously stigmatizing them? So Jeremy Hunt will say, well, oh, but we're putting investment into mental health services or we're allocating resources for that, which is not true actually, whilst we're cracking down on them. So it's at best, it's a mixed message. Now, I don't know why Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt think that they're qualified doctors, that they know more than GPs regarding people's health status, but many charities have warned that if you have someone who is, for example, they're suffering from anxiety, you threaten them that they're going to be sanctioned or they're going to lose money altogether. Of course, that's going to make their anxiety worse. And I think what I find rather sickening about all of this is the Tories and their supporters, the likes of Julia Hartley-Brewer, don't reserve the same venom for tax-dodging billionaires. Including, incidentally, Rishi Sunak's wife. Her tax affairs aren't exactly above board. I don't think that's still fully been addressed. And there's always been this actual keep politicians' family out of it. Well, I agree, unless it gets directly into, the contradictions of what they're proposing. How many of the Tory MPs who support this were themselves implicated in the expenses scandal? Claiming excess from what they were entitled to. Yes, it's going back a bit. It's going back 10, 15 years now. But I don't think it's irrelevant when we're questioning character, when we're questioning, what they're proposing. It's sheer hypocrisy. And I'm sure Jeremy Hunt wasn't squeaky clean in that regard. Um, but what I really dislike about conservative thinking, and this is one thing, I say I'm a conservative on crime, specifically that area, because with crime you have a situation where offenders are hurting the public. They're hurting innocent people, right? So there's a clear, I don't want to say good guy and bad guy, but there is a clear dynamic where they're hurting people. Now, with unemployment, um, the only claimants who are hurting people are those who are frauding the system, which is unfair on the taxpayer, and it's actually unfair on other claimants because it tars them with the same brush. But outside of that, we have a welfare system because it provides a safety net. Now, I have no doubt that given half a chance, the Tories would abolish it completely. They won't do it because they know it isn't politically feasible, but they would if they could get away with it. Um, and like I say, I think they're a survival of the fittest party. I think the Tories look up to wealthy people and they admire them, and they look at people who are struggling and think, well, it must have been something they've done. We better, be hard on them. We better, make them work for it. I saw a meme recently where someone said, let me get this right, because it was quite witty, it was quite poignant, I thought. It said, it's always asked, like, if you're on welfare, how can you afford X, Y, and Z? But no one ever asks, if you're a billionaire or you're even a millionaire, how is it you can afford all these private yachts, but you can't afford to pay a fair wage to your employees? So there's clear double standards in how conservatives, ask those questions. They'll put a big onus of responsibility on people who are struggling, but they put no onus of responsibility on the rich and powerful because they feel, oh, they must have deserved it. They're rich and powerful, so we better admire them. We better look up to them. I was sort of on the fence regarding voting because there are actually some areas I agree with the Tories on. But this is absolutely not one of them, and it's kind of been cemented now. I'm not going to vote Tory. I think they're going to get a hammering at the polls. But what I would like to see from Labour is clear evidence that they are going to take a different approach, that they're not going to be populist in this regard. Rachel Reeves admitted that New Labour left the poor and marginalised behind, yet she has said, she's not going to cap banking bonuses. So I'd watch Rachel Reeves closely. I don't entirely trust her. Um, I want to see a Labour Party who is actually being Labour in this sense. They're not treating unemployed people like they're criminals. Because the Tories basically do in everything but name. And of course, they'll never admit that. They'll say, oh, but we're trying to help people get into work. But what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, Mel Stride and Laura Trott and their bigoted supporters, I say bigoted because that by definition is what they are. If they're looking down, if they're classing an entire group as one and the same, it's bigotry by definition. You know, they just don't get it. They don't know what it's like to go through the DWP. They don't know what it's like to have that constant threat of sanctions. Um, and I'm not going to say I know Julia Hartley-Brewer's life. I'm not going to say she's never had struggles in her life. Maybe she has. Most people have, right? So I won't say that. But I will say she's demonstrating typical reactionary callousness here. It's just like, well, I better be controversial. They're complaining, so I better attack them. Um, there is a lot to be said for compassion in society, and I think the Tories have utterly failed to show any, or at least it's been minimal. There's a lot of things they've failed on in 14 years, but we hear this term compassionate conservatism. Well, you'll get individual Tories who are generous with charity, and on an individual basis, they're probably thoroughly decent people. I don't think individual Tories are evil or bad people, but I do think the narrative and the ideology of the party absolutely is a survival of the fittest mindset. And it's kind of this one size fits all. Like, well, you're struggling, but I struggled as well, and I've got here. We hear the term working class Tory, and they say they're the party of aspirations. Well, my response to that would be people can vote whatever way they want. So if people from a working class background want to vote Tory, that's up to them. Maybe they agree on Brexit or they agree on other areas, and then they may genuinely be different from the left in those areas. But what I do have a problem with is someone who has struggled. They know what it's like, and yet they still turn around and stick their nose up at others. So they're lacking empathy. It's like, I've got mine, but the hell with you. I find that rather despicable. Um, for all it was made of John Major being a working class Tory, um, his government shamelessly stopped, tried to prevent the minimum wage coming through. At the time, they warned it would destroy the economy. No such thing happened. I give New Labour credit for introducing the minimum wage. The Tories didn't even want to do that. And like I say, I thoroughly believe if they could get away with it, they would just abolish the welfare state completely. Um, and it is, to me, a pretty obnoxious side of Tory thinking, this survival of the fittest mindset. There's just a lack of basic human empathy there. um, oh, you're struggling. Well, it must be your own fault. They will not put themselves into people's shoes. And they'll probably argue, but it's unfair on the taxpayers, or it's unfair. Well, what about greedy energy companies? Is that not unfair on the taxpayers? You know, what about greedy billionaires who don't pay their fair share? There's a lot of examples where I don't think the Tories have done enough, but there is there is a mindset of defending the rich and powerful because they're rich and powerful, so they must deserve it. It really sickens me, actually. Um, and like I say, if they were just talking about people who frauded the system, I'd agree with that. But they're not. They're talking in collective, generalizing terms. So, Julia Hartley-Brewer is not the only one. There's other examples. Um, Obnoxious. Absolutely obnoxious, absolutely ignorant. I'm pleased that there is a consensus against that mindset, but there's also quite a lot of people that support it because they believe what they read in the Daily Mail or in the Sun or the Express. Um, so you could say this is a pretty left-wing video. I'm pitching to the left here. There's other areas I say I'm conservative, not in the party sense, but ideologically on crime, I am conservative. But I, differentiate strongly between someone hurting society in the context of being an offender. They're shoplifting from a small business or they're assaulting a stranger, versus someone who's signing on because they have to and they don't want to, but they've had no choice, or they're genuinely sick and they've had to claim incapacity benefits or what have you. Um, there was a film made a few years ago. I've never got around to seeing it. It was called I, Daniel Blake, by Ken Loach, who, granted, is a pretty left wing figure. He's a socialist. He makes those sort of films. I think it was a very important movie. Now, I didn't see it because I thought it would be too depressing. I thought it would be too close to home. Literally, it was set in the northeast of England, and I didn't see it, but I think it was an important film because it showed actually what welfare claimants really go through, not what people think they go through. People will read in the Daily Mail or they'll have seen it on Jeremy Kyle, father of 10 claims benefits through 3 different marriages or something like that. Benefit fraudster rakes up 50,000 when they're pretending to be sick and this sort of thing. So they'll look at extreme cases and assume that is the norm, but it really isn't the norm. The majority of people who are signing on don't want to. Give someone a choice. Would you go through that, the sort of patronising way that's, I'm not saying all job centre staff, but a lot of them do talk down to people. There is a sanction culture there. It's far, far too easily done. That's something I'd like to see Labour tackling. You know, basically put some limits on how easy it is to sanction people, something that Tories and their supporters will never talk about. Um, and just generally take a different narrative to it. I'm not saying that people should just get money from the state with no implications, with no responsibility. But I absolutely think this is a cynical stunt by Sunak before a general election. They're going to lose badly anyway, so it may well be one desperate act of a dying party. But it's a pretty cynical act. And I'm going to wrap this up, but in the end of the day, you can't really. People will believe what they want to believe. They will be quite dogmatic on it, and there may well be people who endorse this because perhaps they have. I don't know. They could have had a neighbour who has been a benefit cheat, and they say, "Oh, this person's getting all of this." And all I would say to those people is, I'm not saying there isn't a problem out there. I'm just saying, don't assume that it is the whole picture, and don't assume that everyone who is signing on is the same. That's what I find contemptible about the narrative put out by Julia Hartley-Brewer and co. Um, how dare she say tough? What if one of her family members got a debilitating disease and had to rely on benefits? Of course, she is from a wealthy background. She doesn't need to worry about that. But the callousness and the ignorance that she and others like her spout out is infuriating because they don't know what it's like. They think they do, but they really, really don't. Um, and whatever they might cite as examples to justify their argument, they're willfully ignoring the many examples that contradict that. So, yeah, this is a left wing side of me, I guess, but it's because I've been through the system, I have empathy. Um, and the fact of the matter is, particularly as knowledge of mental health has increased over the years, is it really surprising that more people are now diagnosed with mental health problems when it is better understood than it was in the past? The reason the figures have went up may not necessarily be that there's a lot of lazy people who just try and get free money. It may well be that because it's better understood, it's now being more widely recognised. Excuse me. So, yes, there will be some people who are taking advantage of the system, but excuse me, it really, really isn't the picnic that these reactionary conservatives think it is. And I would really, really love to see them humbled. I'd like to see some sort of social experiment where they're made to live a week, 2 weeks in the shoes of a claimant to see if they think it is so easy. It's all very well saying, well, the claimant should be signing up to a 35 an hour a week job search, but they'll fill in the applications, they'll do what they have to do. Employer still doesn't get back to them. So this is another component that is just ignored. There's an assumption that they're not trying, but employers have to offer people a job. That's a big part of it. Um, and then they'll say, oh, they should just take any job they get. But even that is important because it would be unreasonable to expect someone who has experience as, say, a teacher or even in the catering industry to then become a forklift driver because they may not have the license for it. Or, so just forcing people into a job where they have no expertise in, okay, give people a training. But I insist that if you're going to make people work, pay them. That's why I'm against workfare, because it's pure exploitation. And again, conservative reactionaries would say, oh, what are they complaining about? They're getting money from the state. But it's not the sort of money they think it is. They think people are just raking in millions or, tens of thousands. It's really, really not like that for most people. So their ignorance and the reactionary attitude to this is pretty grating. Um, but the good news is there's millions of people out there who know the truth. And I just hope Labour, when they get into government, and they almost certainly will take a different approach to this. I'm not expecting them to go the whole way, to be absolutely socialist in this regard, but I would expect them to be more compassionate. If the Labour Party isn't compassionate, then what's it for?